The modern-day battlefield is not composed solely of soil, nor is it limited to the airspace over land. Today, the battlefield is extended over airwaves, the ether, the precious electromagnetic spectrum. In a remote-controlled war, this vital territory must be controlled. This is no computer game. Entire nations and continents are at stake. It's a deadly, serious form of battle. It's called electronic warfare. In its simplest form, electronic warfare is anything done to interfere with an adversary's electronic systems, and all the things done to prevent an enemy from causing similar interference. Electronic frequencies control everything from an intercom radio communication between a pilot and his backseater to radar to a computerized Star Wars-type satellite. The systems that use the electronic warfare spectrum and the jammers that counter them have been developed in the tightest secrecy and have often turned the tide of war. In a world where virtually all weapon systems are now controlled by electronics, electronic warfare officers have perhaps the most at stake in battle.
People liken this form of warfare to a game of chess where one side makes a move and the other side makes a counter move. I would liken this to a lion tamer going into the cage. You'd better have the chair with you when you go and the whip, because if you don't handle it right, that lion will have you and you're a long time dead.
In the United States, the best and brightest from ROTC schools, prestigious universities, and the Air Force Academy come to Randolph Air Force Base to train for this invisible battle.
They are given a lot of technical background. They'll be taught how radars work, how chaff works, how, in pretty much detail, how a lot of the jammers work, flares, and a lot of the other systems that are coming on. Speed and velocity, propagation.
It's 3 months of intensive training requiring an understanding in engineering, physics, mathematics, and basic military strategy. The teachers don't have to manufacture high expectations. The students already ask more of themselves than any teacher possibly could.
I expect to be a fully qualified electronic warfare officer, use any part of the electromagnetic spectrum to defend and jam against radar signals and also against missiles, surface-to-air missiles coming up to attack my aircraft.
The training may be rigorous, but the consequences of not knowing the job could cost an officer's life. The lives of fellow airmen, or even worse, threaten national defense. Electronic warfare is developed into an essential component of American security.
It is deadly, it is fast, it is dangerous, and it is always changing. It's not something that lives in a fixed place in space.
The first case of documented radio jamming occurred not during wartime, but during an America's Cup yacht race back in 1901. Newspaper reporters wanted to get the results of the race out as quickly as possible so they could scoop their competitors. They used spark transmitters capable of sending Morse code to broadcast the position of boats from the race back to their offices. Knowing that 2 spark transmitters could not send a message simultaneously, a one-wire service came up with a plan to beat the competition. A single dash meant that the American boat Columbus was in the lead. 2 10-second dashes meant the British boat Shamrock was in the lead. On it went until the rogue company got all its information through. Then the operator planted his Morse key down and sent a Morse dash lasting 1.5 hours, preventing the competitors from getting their information out. Certainly one of the longest and most underhanded Morse dashes in history. Although the success of cryptanalysis proved to have far greater intelligence value than jamming enemy signals in the First World War, electronic hijinks still played a role. The British erected a chain of direction-finding stations along the east coast of England whose bearings could establish the position of any ship or aircraft using radio in the North Sea area. The stations each sent out radio beams that, when broken by a passing ship or aircraft, would alert an operator that something was traveling nearby. At that time, air defense early warning systems were less sophisticated. They depended on acoustical sound detection. Huge dishes were connected to headsets, and men would listen for enemy airplane engine noise. It would take the revolutionary discovery of radar to bring electronic warfare to the forefront of the battlefield. Throughout the 1930s, the British Air Ministry had a standing reward of £1,000 to anyone who could develop a ray gun that could kill a sheep at 100 yards. Robert Watson Watt, in his attempts to discover the first death ray, found instead that he could actually detect reflected microwaves off of metal objects like ships and aircraft. It didn't take long for the British military to take notice. Though Watt is often credited with being the inventor of radar, other scientists in several different countries serendipitously discovered it around the same time.
During the 1930s, we get radar being developed quite independently in the USA, in France, in Great Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union, and each one of these nations thought that it alone had discovered the secret of radar and was trying to exploit it.
Of all these countries, Great Britain was the most concerned of an attack from the air, and the British military accelerated its research on radar. It also looked for a means to outsmart the technology, both to disable an enemy's radar and to learn ways to protect its own. But the only people who understood radar and how to jam it were the inventors themselves.
It was rather like asking a mother to bear a child and then have to do a vivisection operation on it. People just aren't like that.
But the military insisted on trying to find means to disable radar. So Watt and his crew put a spark transmitter capable of disabling the radar frequency being used in an old vintage World War I fighter. They flew it up and down the east coast of England past several radar stations. The story goes that the scientists didn't try too hard to jam their babies. If the fighter was successful in jamming the ground stations, the British government would have had a very good excuse for cancelling the entire radar program. Instead, the British government made the decision to build a fence of radar sites called the Chain Home Stations around the perimeter of Great Britain. It took years to build the system, but by April 7, 1939, Chain Home Stations stretched from the Isle of Wight in the English Channel to the Firth of Tay in Scotland. In effect, Chain Home allowed the British to blanket the English Channel with radar coverage, creating a wall of radar using multiple frequencies. This gave the British the first radar barrier ever built, one that would soon prove invaluable.
The saviors of Great Britain were people like Watt and his radar stations, as well as the fighters and the men who flew them. The survival of Great Britain was ensured starting about 1935-36, when they began to take defense seriously.
The vital importance of radar as an air defense system was not yet known, but as the Nazi threat and the winds of war blew across Europe and towards the English coastline, radar would very soon be put to the test. In September of 1940, Britain stood alone against the Nazi menace. Hitler had overrun Europe with relative ease and now set his sights on England. The British war machine was just beginning to build the kind of air force that could fight off an attack, but troops in England were still greatly outnumbered and outgunned. No secret to the Germans or the British. The gamesmanship for control of the ether began with a journey by Edward Taffy Bowen, a young civilian scientist working for the British Air Ministry. On a blustery day in September 1940, Bowen paced the platform at London's Euston Station, gripping an innocuous black suitcase about the size of a bread box. He was understandably nervous, because he carried not only papers describing the British military's latest advances in radar technology, but also a working magnetron radar. A magnetron was a small, advanced radar system that could be installed in fighter planes. No other country possessed this technology. If it were to fall into the wrong hands, it could tip the balance of the war. Although the magnetron technology worked, it contained glitches, and the British didn't have the manpower and resources to work out all the problems. But if they didn't get this radar in the nation's night fighters, planes that were outfitted to counter Germany's night attacks, Great Britain may have succumbed to the Luftwaffe's relentless bombings. Winston Churchill, in a bold move to get this technology online quickly, decided to share all of Britain's technological secrets with scientists in the United States. But nothing hastened the development of U.S. radar more than the events at Pearl Harbor. At 6:30 a.m. on December 7, 1941, Private Joseph Lockhart's cathode ray screen came alive with so much clutter that he thought it had gone haywire. He was manning the radar station at Opana, on the northern tip of Oahu. After a systems check indicated all was well, he decided that 130 miles offshore lay the biggest aircraft formation he had ever seen on radar. Lieutenant Tyler at the Information Center listened to Lockhart's report, and a bell went off in his head. The Army paid a local radio station to broadcast a specific musical number whenever aircraft were headed towards the island base. This was a way of furnishing aircraft with a friendly homing signal. By chance, the song was playing. Tyler concluded Lockhart's radar clutter must have been a flight of friendly bombers approaching, and told Lockhart to disregard the signal.
This was nothing conscious that the Japanese did. It was a failure in an American system, but the thing was, you hadn't learned to trust your radar as the British had been forced to do, and I have great sympathy for the commander there on that day.
Despite British and American work to perfect jamming techniques and countermeasures, the first large-scale use of electronic warfare came during a German operation called Servius, better known as the Channel Dash. In February 1942, 3 German warships, the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, were trapped by the Royal Navy in Brest off the Brittany coast of France. German naval Gross Admiral Erich Raeder wanted his ships home. He was afraid that if he took them out into the Atlantic, they would be hunted down by the Royal Navy, as the Bismarck was in 1942. Instead of taking a long trip around Great Britain, past Greenland and Iceland, and then home, the Germans decided to take an extremely risky 6-hour shortcut through the English Channel.
Pas-de-Calais in France and the Cliffs of Dover in Great Britain becomes the most surveilled piece of Earth on the planet. You have radars looking at airplanes, radars looking at ships. This area literally becomes a place where you cannot go and row a boat without getting noticed.
I interviewed the navigating officer on the Scharnhorst, and he told me that the crew really were very frightened at having to do this operation. He'd written his last letter to his wife because he really didn't think that they were going to succeed in getting through to Germany.
The Germans' route plan included fighter cover, escorting destroyers and torpedo boats. But at its core was deception through radar jamming, including fixed jammers along the French coast, a heavily utilized system well known to the Allies. As these German ships passed the British radar sites, the shore-based jammers turned on their equipment. At the time, many of the best British radar operators had transferred to North Africa. Those now manning the Channel radar hadn't experienced this type of jamming before.
By the time they got the whole thing sorted out, the German ships were through the Channel and they managed to make it back to Germany. This very bold operation was very successful.
It had always been clear that the Germans had some sort of radar capability, but Allied codebreakers and spies had yet to discover what that was. R.V. Jones, a 28-year-old British scientist, had been given the task of not only discovering the German radar grid, but also of countering and eventually overwhelming it.
He was, if you will, a fantastic generalist, and one of the things he had a particular skill for was understanding what the dangers of an enemy having radar technology was going to do to Great Britain.
In 1939, a mysterious package was found just outside the British Embassy in Oslo, Norway. It was forwarded to Jones, since it contained top-secret documents that appeared to outline Germany's amazing advances in radar and rocket technology. Many in the British intelligence community thought the report was a hoax, but Jones believed its authenticity. This became known as the Oslo Report, and Jones would often refer to its contents. Jones learned that the Germans were beaming very high radio frequencies at Britain from Kleve on the German-Dutch border and from Schleswig-Holstein near Denmark. He presented these findings to Churchill, who gave him the go-ahead to carry out countermeasures.
This led, in fact, to several actual uses of armed force by the British to actually reach out and grab pieces of German radar technology so that they could evaluate it and see where it was going.
British intelligence discovered that Freya, the Norse goddess of beauty, was the German code name for a certain type of radar. Freya was used to search the ether for long-range threats. Another model, called Würzburg, could detect threats at short range and direct searchlights to expose RAF bombers in the night sky. Jones and his team had a reasonable understanding of Freya technology, but the Würzburg was still a mystery. Countermeasures had to be found to neutralize the system if the Allies hoped to recapture the European continent. Around 1 a.m. on February 27, 1942, 119 Scottish paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines in northern France near Saint-Bruneval. One group held the beach, another secured the villa, and a third stormed the radar facility. A technician, C.W.H. Cox, a movie projectionist before the war, was chosen to dismantle the Würzburg radar. Cox was supposed to have half an hour to dismantle the Würzburg. But mortar fire forced Major John D. Frost, the commander of the mission, to order an early retreat. Cox still managed to remove the German contraption in half the time. The Würzburg was loaded on a cart and pulled down to the beachhead with mortar rounds exploding everywhere. The paratroopers were able to find the beach and help their comrades escape onto a waiting Navy landing craft. By 2:30 a.m., one of the most daring operations of the war was over. It was a decisive blow. German air defenses along the coast were now partially blind, allowing RAF bombers easier access to the European continent. During the second half of 1942, Wynne Salisbury, an American scientist working on the Harvard University campus, discovered that the Würzburg radar could be jammed by dropping strips of aluminum foil over the target, filling German radar screens with false echoes. The foil was nicknamed chaff. It took nearly a year before the Allies agreed to use chaff in the field. One of the worries was that the Germans would realize its effectiveness and use it on bombing runs over London. With no countermeasure, the English capital could become an inferno. But Allied commanders gambled on the theory that if they hit hard and early, the Germans would be back in their heels long enough for the Allied scientists to come up with a defense for their own invention. On a July night in 1943, bombers were instructed to dump chaff over the port of Hamburg.
They had a box, like a shoebox, and in there was the right number of strips so that when they were pushed out the flare chute, they would give an echo the size of an aircraft. And you can imagine that if you had 25 Flying Fortress bombers in a formation, each of them putting out one of these shoebox-sized amounts of chaff once every 30 seconds or so as they went through the flak defences. That put a lot of echoes in the sky for the enemy gunners to shoot at.
Jamming radar during bombing runs is one thing, but to confuse an enemy into believing a fictitious army is ready to invade is quite another. This is exactly what a series of electronic spoofs intended to do just prior to and during the most important operation of the war, the D-Day invasion. One of the first priorities of this operation, known as Overlord, was to knock out as many of the German radar stations in France as possible. But it was just as important not to give a hint of where the invasion would take place. For every target attacked in the area of the intended invasion, 2 more were to be attacked elsewhere, to keep the Germans guessing. For this deception, Dr. Robert Cockburn, head of British countermeasures at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, and his team of scientists were putting the finishing touches on the most elaborate piece of electronic wizardry ever to support a military operation. The simulation on radar of 2 huge ghost fleets of ships and supporting aircraft to divert attention away from the main Allied landings. Cockburn worked out a method of producing a huge radar echo by dropping lengths of metal foil from aircraft flying carefully arranged routes. It was like building a huge radar reflector covering an area of 256 square miles. The echo patterns appeared far to the north of the actual invading force.
Just imagine the scene on that night. There'll be a half-trained conscript radar operator, frightened, sitting at a radar screen on the coast of France, and suddenly he sees this huge radar echo in front of him, and he telephones through to his headquarters and tells them what he's seen. So does somebody to the left of him, so does somebody to the right of him.
German commanders still feared another landing and failed to move divisions to Normandy for weeks. The Allies had their foothold on the continent. By the end of World War II, it was clear that electronics would be an integral part of any future war. As the conventional war cooled down, the struggle for superiority in the electronic war would continue to heat up. The end of the 1940s brought peace and prosperity to much of the world, but it was a fragile peace delineated by strict ideological borders. Russian and Chinese communism versus Western capitalism led by the United States. The war in Korea pitted one side against the other in a battle of North versus South, and the war in the ether continued to play a vital role.
The Russian-built radars that are being deployed in that country are very similar to the equipments that were in use in World War II, and indeed the B-29s carried exactly the same jamming equipment, by and large, that they had carried in World War II.
U.S. Air Force B-26s conducted raids to suppress flak in support of B-29 bombing raids against North Korea by actually bombing searchlights. The radar, or sound-guided searchlights, were used by communist gunners to illuminate the bombers overhead. The lights proved to be a difficult target, but the overall results of U.S. electronic countermeasures, chaff, and B-26 searchlight suppression reduced losses from fighters and flak. Still, in general, the electronic warfare techniques used in Korea were merely an extension of tactics used in World War II. As a tenuous ceasefire took effect between North and South Korea, the nuclear buildup between the Soviet Union and the United States began in earnest. Learning which electronic measures and countermeasures each side possessed was a primary objective in the deadly game of cat-and-mouse espionage that would be waged for years. During the late 50s, a new deadly electronic weapon emerged, the Surface-to-Air Guided Missile, or SAM, which depended on two-way communication from a ground radar station to continually maneuver the missile towards its target. Both the Soviets and NATO used SAMs, but the trick was to know the exact radio frequency the missiles were using for guidance and, obviously, where the small mobile SAM sites were located.
We had a passenger airplane, and we had windows on the side in which we were able to hold this little device that was about probably 15 inches long and had a handle on it. And we would point it in the direction of where we thought a SAM site would be. And we had a headset, and we would hear the tones of the radar that was going on. It was a game in which both sides knew what the rules were, and we both played it.
But the game became deadly on May 1st, 1960. An American U-2 spy plane took off from Pakistan for an overflight of the USSR. There was nothing unusual about the flight, nothing that hadn't been done before, and nothing the Soviets hadn't seen before.
There were times when the Soviets would send MiGs up, but again, we knew that only if somebody got a wild bug that he would try to shoot us down.
But for whatever reason, the Soviets suddenly shot down the U-2. What really made U.S. intelligence nervous was what the Soviets might learn from the downed plane. It carried a Granger box containing some of the latest U.S. countermeasure electronics, including sophisticated jamming devices to help protect the plane from SAM technology. Had the Soviets recovered this equipment intact, U.S. planes might have become more vulnerable to attack. To this day, it's not clear what they learned, if anything, from pilot Francis Gary Powers' downed U-2. In Vietnam, more sophisticated surface-to-air missiles added a new and lethal dimension to aerial warfare.
Vietnam really was the turning point for electronic warfare. You now have anti-aircraft guns, fighters, radars, control centers, and surface-to-air missiles, all tied together in a large defensive network.
Although the Germans had dabbled in crude-guided missiles toward the end of the Second World War, nothing as lethal and accurate as the SAM had been used in wartime. The downing of the occasional reconnaissance plane was one thing, but bringing down scores of fighter bombers was quite another. The North Vietnamese had a sophisticated and integrated air defense system developed with the latest Soviet technology. It included Fansong radar, numerous SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, as well as radar-directed anti-aircraft artillery guns, known as AAA.
Of course, the AAA just tore up the airplanes. It was hitting us very badly. Then they moved up in altitude so that they could stay out of the range of the AAA. And of course, the SAMs came up. They began to get hit by the SAMs.
It was clear that the fighter bombers couldn't survive down low against the AAA, so a method had to be devised to defeat the SAMs. The North Vietnamese missile system included several elements, the first of which was named Spoonrest, which was a circular scanning surveillance radar. This generally indicated where the targets were. The other radar was the Fansong, and it had a very narrow angle, allowing it to track targets at close range. The wide and narrow band radars had to work in tandem to be effective.
Supposing there were flies in the room and you had a flashlight to try and illuminate them, it would be very difficult to find where they were on the ceiling if you didn't have the light on in the room to give you a rough idea where to look. If you had to search with your flashlight, it would take you a long time to find them.
These integrated SAMs were highly effective, destroying 8% of U.S. fighters in Vietnam and forcing planes to fly lower, making them vulnerable to ground fire. Eventually, American pilots learned that it was possible to evade SAMs. If the skies were clear when a missile was launched, pilots could actually see the puff of smoke from the ground as well as get a signal on their radar. They'd turn their aircraft on either side so they could see the missile clearly from their cockpits.
The first thing they wanted to know is, can I see the side of the missile, or is it pointing straight towards me? Obviously, if it's pointing straight towards you, then that's the time you've got to do something about it.
Pilots were told to push the nose of the plane into a full dive when the missile got within 1 mile, and then pull up so they could get inside its angle of maneuverability. SAMs had limited steering ability, so this type of evasion usually worked.
The problem was sometimes that coming behind the first missile was the second missile and perhaps even the third missile, and you might do a magnificent job of avoiding the first two, but the third one gets you, so that was always a problem.
The day I was shot down, there was another pilot shot down and captured as well. And one of the challenges that you have is when there are multiple SAMs, multiple surface-to-air missiles in the air, picking out which one is aimed at you and dodging it complicates the problem rather significantly.
A man named Inky Halgan, working at Eglin Test Center in Florida, found the answer. It was simple but extremely effective because it took advantage of the flaws in Vietnam's radar system. Halgan developed a flight of 4 aircraft equally spaced in a jamming pod formation. Aircraft were to fly exactly 1,500 feet apart, so the ground radar operators would only see a series of jamming strobes on the screen, but they couldn't pick out exactly where the aircraft were.
Provided you were to sit there and hold your formation, you could see the missile streaking through the jamming formation and going off way past you, perfectly harmlessly.
After the countermeasures effort had been running smoothly for about 9 months, the North Vietnamese radar operators became very adept at seeing through the jamming. If American pilots wavered in the formation by even a few feet, the missiles found their mark.
North Vietnamese were very good because they saw jamming every day. As they got better, they were able to see through, and they would get aircraft that strayed outside this 1,500-foot box, so to speak, and they could hit those aircraft.
The U.S. Air Force and Navy weren't content to just jam the radar sites or depend on evasive action to neutralize the SAMs. They wanted to eliminate these sites on the ground in order to make the skies safe enough for their bombers to hit targets with impunity. This secret mission was given to a new breed of fighter pilots, the Wild Weasels. These crews flew modified F-4s or F-105s on missions dedicated solely to attacking radar sites. A pilot navigated the plane on its dangerous course. A backseat electronics warfare officer operated the complicated equipment that would foil the ground radar defenses. It was an heroic assignment, but also a very dangerous one.
There's an argument to be made that if you were in the Air Force in the mid to late 1960s, the single most dangerous job you could have is being a Wild Weasel crewman.
A Wild Weasel was essentially electronically naked without jammers. Like bait on a hook, the pilot trolled for radar signals, waiting for the enemy to lock up on them.
We were the decoys. As far as the mission was concerned, we wanted them to come after us because we were prepared to go after them.
The Weasels wanted the North Vietnamese to launch as many SAMs as possible so that the other Weasels in the vicinity could fire anti-radiation missiles back at the sites on the ground. A Shrike was a heat-seeking anti-radiation missile known also as a HARM that could home in on a radar beam, follow it until it reached its source, and then explode, taking out the radar.
Once we would see a radar that was on the air, we would try to line up and fire a Shrike at him to go after and shut down, at least shut down his antenna.
In the meantime, the SAM was locked on and coming straight for the Weasel at Mach 3. The Weasel pilot had to dogfight the missile and get out of the way. If he was lucky, there was only one.
You feel the shock wave as it goes past you, but his fuse isn't working right, or he may be going somewhere else, or who knows why he doesn't explode. But yeah, it's a scary situation, but you don't have time to think about being scared.
Only 3 Medals of Honor given to pilots flying fixed-wing aircraft during the Vietnam War all went to people who were doing the anti-SAM mission, the Wild Weasel mission.
The secret tactics learned in Vietnam were invaluable to the development of electronic warfare and set the stage for a stunning operation years later in the Gulf War. As U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War wound down, new developments in electronic warfare were left on the shelves, untested. Many of the Weasel backseaters, or electronic warfare specialists, were reassigned to desk jobs in the States.
When I left Vietnam, I went to the Pentagon. This was in the early part of '69, and I became responsible for the operational aspects of all fighter EW and the Wild Weasels. So I got involved in the development of the new systems, the new Wild Weasel.
More sophisticated radar monitoring equipment went into the conversion from the F-105F to the F-105G. It carried standard armaments plus the new Harm-Shrike missile. At the same time, the Air Force was enhancing the F-4 Wild Weasel, or the F-4G. Each F-4G had ECM, or electronic countermeasures, material that could foil radar detection, blistered into the side of the aircraft. Every time intelligence information indicated a change in Soviet SAM technology, computers designed to jam them aboard U.S. planes became obsolete and had to be replaced.
But a bunch of us in the Pentagon decided we should take advantage of this intelligence information and start the drums to get the digital warning system in the inventory so that we could make changes to it through software rather than hardware.
They were able to get money from the Air Force, obtain top priorities, and get a testable device ready by July of 1972.
And then we wanted to find a place to test it. So we knew that the Soviets wouldn't probably cooperate with us in Eastern Europe. So I asked the Israeli Air Force if they would help us. And the Israeli Air Force said, yeah, we'll help you, except we would like to have that for our airplanes if we tested for you.
A team of logistics specialists, engineers, and other contractors went to Israel in August of 1972. They flew several missions on Israeli F-4Es against Egyptian air defenses, which did have SA-3s, though not the SA-4s. The tests proved very successful. Whenever the enemy would change frequencies on their SAMs or any other characteristics, it would be just a matter of reprogramming the plane's software instead of tearing out a whole system to adjust to the changes.
So we took the analog system, turned it into a digital system, and got this in the inventory. And the grandson of this same digital system is now flying in the F-16s of our inventory today.
The lessons learned in Israel would be put into practice 2 decades later when coalition forces faced another threat in the Middle East. Iraq was the biggest geographic target the United States ever tried to take on, with the exception of the Soviet Union. It was protected by what was arguably the finest integrated air defense system ever seen. Culled together in the late 80s by different systems from the Soviet Union, China, Germany, and France, it included the finest radar, computers, surface-to-air missiles, fighters, and guns Iraqi money could buy. Known as the Kari system, it was woven like a big spider web throughout the country, protecting virtually every piece of Saddam Hussein's domain. General Chuck Horner, commander of the air war in the Gulf, was tasked to find a way through this secret maze.
It is August of 1990, and you have a terrible problem. You have just been put in charge of potentially having to take an Air Force and go into this environment and conduct a large bombing campaign. You're going to have to bomb strategic targets around Iraq. You're also going to have to go over here and you're going to have to bomb an army into submission down in Kuwait. And all of this is tied together. You have to find a way to obviously take down and destroy the Kari system. What do?
General Horner didn't hesitate. He chose Brigadier General Larry Henry, a wild weasel backseater who flew in Southeast Asia. Considered by his peers to be one of the most skilled tacticians in electronic warfare, it would be Henry's job to break the back of Iraq's carry system.
With the Iraqi armored forces, you would find SA-6s, SA-8s, SA-9s, which are very capable missile systems. And when you lay that with the command and control system in Kuwait and long-range surface-to-air missiles such as SA-2s, their armor and attacking forces would have a significant umbrella over the top of them. My job, in a nutshell, was to erase that and knock out that umbrella.
Larry Henry and his team spent 2 months poring over secret blueprints from a French company that put the system together. They got classified specifications from around the world for all the different radar and communications links and started looking at them as a complete system.
It's not just the hard shooting elements, the fighters, the SAMs, the guns. It's also the power, the electrical grid, the communications links, the radio links, the computers that run it.
Electronically, the carry system was like a medieval fortress with big, high walls that you had to either break down or get inside and attack from within. Henry found a way to get in electronically and helped design a plan that became known as Puba's Party. Puba was Henry's call sign when he was a weasel. The party was an electronic fireworks display, the magnitude of which had never been seen.
The very first thing that happened in the assault was the Army Apache helicopters went in and took out the very low frequency radars, early warning radars. Those radars have a low enough frequency so that you can begin seeing stealth aircraft.
Henry and his team knew that they had to make the Iraqi SAM operators think they were picking up signals from a sizable strike force before the operators would be willing to light up their radar. Just minutes after the Baghdad control centers had been destroyed, about 40 BQM-74 target drones were launched from Saudi Arabia. Simultaneously, aircraft coming in from the west dropped a whole series of Israeli-made glider decoys called tactical air launch decoys. At this point, there was something that on radar looked big enough to be a strike force.
So the Iraqi operators of the radars and SAM sites all turn on their radars and they begin to engage. And probably something between 100 and 200 surface-to-air missiles go off flying at these decoys. And they've turned their radars on.
At that moment, every aircraft that could carry a high-speed anti-radiation missile came up and fired at those Iraqi radar sites. The results were spectacular. Over 100 Iraqi radar of all varieties never came back on. They were destroyed for the rest of the war.
We had a sequence of events, I think, which allowed the stealth airplanes to come and go unseen and bomb. And it's very disconcerting, I think, if you're an enemy and you don't see an airplane but you're getting bombed. How did that happen? And then you see airplanes and you're getting bombed, but they're not really airplanes. And when you try to destroy the airplane, somebody destroys the thing you're trying to shoot those airplanes down with. I believe that the electronic combat contribution to the air campaign was significant and helped a lot.
Within the first few hours of Desert Storm, coalition forces had managed to take control of the skies. Puba's party was a complete success. The Gulf War confirmed that in modern battle, he who controls the ether controls the war. Almost daily, there's a new advance in electronic technology. Scientists, technicians, and engineers are constantly incorporating those advances into weapon systems, new and old, in hopes of gaining an edge in the electronic battlefield. Electronic warfare never stands still. Measures and countermeasures change constantly, and it takes a concerted effort not only to keep up with those changes, but also to develop new electronic capabilities. One only hopes that in the next confrontation he has tricks that the enemy hasn't thought of yet.
This is that whole pendulum of measure, countermeasure. You have to constantly update the electronic order of battle. You constantly have to get that information out to the planners and make sure they know, okay, they've moved these SAM sites from here, here, and here, and they've moved them down here, here, and here.
Over 16,000 people worldwide make up the Air Intelligence Agency arm of the United States Air Force. Their mission is to exploit, defend, and attack, and to ensure superiority in the air, space, and information domains. Many of these experts are stationed at Kelly Air Force Base in Texas as part of the Air Force Information Warfare Center and the Joint Command and Control Warfare Center. Sensor Harvest is a command and control warfare analysis system they rely on. It targets countries by looking at specific areas where they might be vulnerable to electronic intrusion.
The nice thing about Sensor Harvest, it gives the air component commander a variety of options beyond physical destruct. I found in my time in Bosnia last year that going and blowing things up was the least desirable plan.
Sensor Harvest uses advanced computer technology to provide vital information on EW targets. In this case, it's a fictional country.
What we do is we gather information where things such as an electronic order of battle will show us where the enemy has positioned their equipment and their military units.
It takes about 6 months for Sensor Harvest to analyze and build a virtual country, including SAM sites, radar, electric grids, and other vital electronic areas. Once built, this intricate information serves as a valuable tool for operations out in the field as well as for strategists in the Pentagon.
This is the target aircraft that's the missile's aimed at. Off in the distance we have the firing aircraft. It's going to fire an infrared air-to-air missile at the target. Once the missile is shot, we'll see once the simulation starts, the aircraft will fly in this direction and the missile will chase it. This corner up here shows the eye of the missile. This is what the missile is looking at. So when we fire it, we can see that the missile starts to track and it's chasing the airplane. This next scenario is the same as the one we just showed you, except this time the aircraft will release 3 salvos of 4 flares.
But even with the best technology and the best minds in the world, perfection is still unattainable. Witness Operation Allied Force, the NATO air war to dislodge the Serbian army from Kosovo in 1999. This was the first major war fought totally from the air, and every high-tech asset available to the NATO forces was put into play. One of the most advanced was the stealth F-117 fighter. When one was shot down, it sent shockwaves throughout the electronic warfare community.
They didn't put together an EW war that took out the Yugoslav air defenses immediately. The early warning radars that can see stealth a little bit were still operating.
The F-117 flew the same route exiting the target 4 nights in a row. On the 4th night, the Serbians were waiting for it and shot up a blanket of missiles that the stealth flew into.
There's an old engineering adage, if you can't repeat it, you haven't done it. And the Yugoslavs were never able to do it again. So it shows that there was a countermeasure that was brought in by the US forces to prevent that happening again.
Does the rapid evolution of electronic warfare, having come so far in such a short time, suggest that the next wars will be fought exclusively in the electronic spectrum? Will they be bloodless games of electronic wizardry won by those with the better gadgets or tricks, measures, and countermeasures?
What we have seen is that the attacks on the troops probably achieved very little at all. But the attacks on the Yugoslav economy, like knocking out bridges and knocking out their electrical system, from the NATO point of view, there was nobody killed. They could have carried on that action just as long as was necessary.
The Yugoslavs saw their economy being taken out all around them. The only solution was to surrender. Maybe this is the pattern of the war of the future. Then again, maybe not.
One of the great misconceptions about electronic warfare and air power in general is the idea that they can win wars by themselves. They can't. What they can do, though, is they can enable ground forces, naval forces, forces that have the ability to provide presence.
It's impossible to predict exactly how future wars will be fought. But it is certain that electronic warfare, the Wizard War, born when the first electric pulse coursed through a metal wire, is now as ubiquitous as the microwave oven in kitchens. And it's just as clear that a nation's ability to stay ahead in this ethereal chess match will determine its viability as a military force in the future.